En 1982, ils ont acheté l'ordinateur le plus puissant de la planète. En 1984, ils ont fait les effets visuels de The Last Starfighter et 2010, l'année du premier contact. En 1986, ils ont créé le premier animal virtuel pour le Labyrinthe de Jim Henson. Vous connaissez les films, mais connaissez-vous les personnes qui les ont faits? Voici l'histoire de ces pionniers du numérique, l'histoire du studio Digital Productions.
I was born in 1946. My mother and father were interested in both film, art, and music, which is a key factor that drew them together. And it was a key factor in the cultural and social life of the family, the early background in which I grew up. They were both very important influences continuously throughout my career. In early formative years, I found myself increasingly drawn to the abstract filmmaking that my father and uncle were doing and to the methods that they used. I was particularly close with my father in that I was present with him at certain key milestones when he made, I think, striking discoveries in order to realize their vision on the screen. My uncle Jim, his brother Jim, they began filmmaking in the late 30s using very exhaustive, time-consuming manual animation methods, and they developed all their own equipment for that. And this was the unique relationship between John and Jim. I had a chance then to not only learn how to utilize that equipment for my own filmmaking purposes, but also to execute some of the contractual business of motion graphics, and the stage was set for early 70s when I first saw the work at Evans and Sutherland in a sample reel that they made, and I was so mesmerized by it and so taken with it that I began to develop a vision for how that could be utilized in the future, and if I could help find a way myself to nurture that forward, that was what galvanized my career. I began to make visits to the studios in Hollywood and try and talk about what interest there might be in utilizing these tools for special effects. And I'm not even sure I had a production facility or to offer at the time, but those were great meetings because I really got to meet the tail end of the heyday of the studio system and the production executives, and they had no idea how to use it. They could see it, it was going to be powerful. But little did any of us know that some decades later that the top grossing blockbuster films were not going to be live action films. They were going to be 100% CGI.
Your move.
They had a sense that they wanted to do something to show what they thought might be evoking a computer robot's way of looking at the world, which came up with that simple block thing. So the question was, could it be done in motion? I knew that Information International had film recorders that would move 35mm film through a gate that would be registered well enough to, again, through my father, Information International. My father had met Ed Fredkin, who was the founder of it, and he had generously received Ed's support in opening the doors to the company and using its film recorders and access to some of the wonderful programmers that were there. It was essential to have that equipment. I had that equipment. And then the next step was to write the programs that would de-res, actually turn into blocks and stuff. And you'd think that would be easy to do. It was a struggle to write that code. I don't know why, but we barely made it. And in order to help facilitate the effect, I remember we had physical effects where somebody would put yellow footprints on the ground to help make it show up better in the block imaged rendition of it, which actually turned out to work out very well.
After my junior year of high school, I was on a summer program at the University of Southern California, and they had a 360 IBM computer there, which they let us be hands-on with. That was really my first experience with computers. And then I went to Caltech after that, and There were large IBM 360 models there, and they ended up with a PDP-10 that was an interactive machine, whereas the IBMs were not normally interactive, or at least not very interactive. Looking into all that, I discovered that John Whitney Sr. was running some experimental filmmaking, originally the IBM machines and then later on the PDP-10 machine, and took an interest in that and ended up providing him some interfaces and some other things, and generally was fascinated by the quality of the images that he was making. After I got out of Caltech, I became aware of the work of the University of Utah and Ivan Sutherland in particular, and went to work with Ivan for a few years. Ended up exploring whether we could start a company. It turned out to be hard to do in the 1970s, but John Whitney Jr. I met up with, he suggested that we contact Information International, also called III. So we made a presentation to the board of III, and that obviously included Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. Early important people in the history of artificial intelligence, and Marvin Minsky had been a thesis advisor to Ivan Sutherland. That was what's got us started. That gave us the credibility we needed because they knew everything we had done. At the University of Utah, some very early work around 1970 of Ed Catmull and Fred Park showed a hand and a face. They were pretty simple by today's standards, but they showed promise, and they were created from plaster of Paris castings. But we thought if we took a real person and we put them with multiple cameras from different directions, we could get the three-dimensional data that we needed. So we proposed doing that on Futureworld for a sequence where they're creating a robot of Peter Fonda. I believe we projected grids on them. We had slide projectors. So when we took photographs, we used registered moving picture cameras. When we took those pictures, they automatically had witness grids that you could see from all the different directions, and that gave us what we needed for three-dimensional encoding of Peter Fonda. We captured his face and his entire body standing up, but I think we only ended up using the face. Ed Catmull's hand was in Futureworld as well, so it was an interesting synergy.
Things had changed quite a bit in the relationship from the Westworld to the Futureworld. So we had created a division of III called the Motion Picture Project, or we had other names for it, but we had finally separate quarters in there with our equipment and staff.
In the late 1970s, we became aware of the movie Meteor. At that point, we were starting to be able to simulate rockets and spaceships and things. That the plot obviously involves sending a rocket up to deflect a meteor. And they were more interested in just line drawings and effects, although they were going to put them full screen, not just on monitors. And so we ended up doing a nice little portion of work, which was actually a lot of fun because of all the movie stars that worked in that movie. We invited various people to see what we were doing because we were making good progress. And one of the people we invited over was George Lucas. He was working on the original Star Wars in 1977 and was interested in us making computer graphics for monitors. We weren't terribly interested in that, but he saw what we were doing, so we made him aware, and also people at Industrial Light and Magic called ILM. As we made progress, we ended up being able to do higher and higher scene complexity, even though our computing was kind of limited at the time. And we eventually were able to make an X-Wing.
We were trying to prove that, yeah, you could go ahead and do things you can't do with miniatures. The first step for us was to actually digitize the X-Wing. That was my mission, which I actually enjoyed doing because I always enjoyed making real models. I went out and bought a plastic model, put it together, and then did drawings. A side view, front view, and a top view. I think we had about 60,000 polygons in that ship ultimately, which was a lot for their time, you know, and now they have objects, millions of polygons, many of which were created by hand, point by point, point by point. Eventually, once the model was finished, then Gary Demos, took the database, lit it, colored it, a little bit of texturing. We shot some 4x5 stills, pictures that we thought would convince that, yeah, we can make something look real. And so George Lucas came in one day and we gave him like a stack of 4x5 transparencies, 4 inches by 5 inches, we thought, oh, we got him. He's interested, he's going to love it. And he comes back, the first thing that he says to all of us was a shock. He says, "This is not my ship. My ships have been through wars. They've been through battles. They got battle scars. They're dented, they're rusted, they have oil stains, they're dirty." And he was absolutely right, absolutely right. He saw it as a filmmaker.
He suggested dirtying it up, and
Mel McMillan came up with ways to dirty it up, to dent it up, and almost overnight.
So we did that and refined it, and then showed it again, showed it to our friend Richard Edlund at ILM. We had this in the summer of 1978. It took us a year from there to get permission to show it, but they eventually gave us permission, and that ended up being the cover of Computer Magazine in 1979 in August. August is a good month because it's the computer conference called SIGGRAPH. It made a lot of impression on a lot of people that we could do something with that level of detail. And that was essentially a proof of principle for Last Starfighter when we ended up getting able to do that. And it also, we did a motion with 5 X-Wings in a peel-off that couldn't be done with models. We were starting to get some traction on what was possible.
But unfortunately in those days, because nobody knew the potential or what computer graphics and animation could do, you had to kind of prove yourself first before they would offer you any money to actually create it.
After Steven Spielberg made Jaws, he came over for a visit. He had this movie in the works with science fiction theme, and wondered if we wanted to do some tests for it. So he presented the idea of a free moving camera that could look anywhere that we could track and put three-dimensional objects in the scene that it's looking at. They had a scene where the little white squares were glowing. They called them cuboids. And so we had to, first of all, make things that looked like they were bright and glowing. But in addition to that, we had to work out how to do the three-dimensional aspects of a freeform camera move. Vilmos Zsigmond was the cinematographer on the crane, and he was allowed to move the camera anywhere as long as he could see our witness points, which were little globes of lights. And they were all at known positions, so we were able to extrapolate back. And we proved, at least to ourselves, that we could track perfectly. We didn't end up getting the work. I think it was a little early for us, but it was a great project.
Everything was trial and error. Everything was, is this going to work?
We had worked with Michael Crichton in the 1970s. John Whitney Jr. stayed in touch with Michael, and they talked fairly often. Michael Crichton saw what we were doing and thought, gee, it would be neat to make a movie about simulating models, simulating actresses, and making commercials. So he wrote the Looker script based on that perception that that would be possible at some point, and then we figured we could take it as far as we could take it on the way to realism. Just like when we had encoded Peter Fonda for Futureworld, we set up a rig to encode Susan Day, who was the actress in the movie.
We didn't have to white her out anymore. Creating a database for the head it evolved, and there was also a whole body.
Susan Day stood in front of multiple mirrors, and the mirrors gave us different angles, so we only used one camera with multiple views instead of multiple cameras. And instead of projecting on her grids, Art Durinsky and Larry Malone drew right on her face, dots and lines. And so we were able to turn that into three-dimensional data. Our expert, Mel McMillan, was able to compensate for the camera and the mirrors and all the distortions and get really excellent data.
The breast model came in for the body. Susan Day was not contractually committed to do that. But so we brought in a model. It didn't matter, really.
Didn't look like Susan Day at all in terms of her physique. Her body had to be rearranged to make it look more like Susan's body. And then it had to be stitched together, the head with the body. And that was a chore to accomplish by software that Malcolm McMillan wrote. There's a couple points in the movie where there's just gibberish generated by the computer. So I typed it, just kind of like scrolled up and down, and we put our names in there. I think each of us got our own credit in that segment. Yeah, it was fun. I mean, that happens quite a bit in movies.
Once we had that setup with the multiple mirrors, you could look from one spot and see all sides and down. You could see from above. We thought we should try a moving test in there. And so one of our people at the Information International Company was capable of juggling and backflips and things. So we put him in front of the mirrors and started the camera. It was a moving image camera anyway. Captured data in 3 dimensions for the juggler.
We thought, well, let's have him do something that would be impossible. And so he juggles upside down, which if you ever tried it, it's not that easy to do.
Well, I know I came up with the name, Adam Powers.
John Whitney Jr. named Adam because first computer man.
I actually copyrighted that name at one point.
And Powers, his second name was Powers, and that's because he could do anything. He was all powerful.
That's when Richard Taylor came in, and he was quite gifted at using the features that were depicted there. That was a sample reel effort to show more of what could be done as it evolved to at that point.
And as a designer, it was like, wow, what can we do? We can do anything. You can set up one kind of reality, set it up, make people believe in that reality, and then you break that reality and you have another.
I got to know the director and producer pretty well. We've been planning this for 2 years, I think was the time frame. That was to trigger an agreement with the president of III to unleash more capital so we could develop sufficient production capacity to take on the scope of work that I'd hoped would be Information International's contract.
But as the project neared getting a green light, it looked like we couldn't have the project in its entirety. They were going to farm it out to everybody and have each company do a piece of the work.
The scope of work that III took on was greatly reduced.
They just wanted to use it to do their portion of the TRON movie.
And so that forced the studio to look elsewhere and farm out piecemeal.
I always thought it was meant to be subdivided up between different companies. III, I think, did the majority of the shots, and the ones that look more realistic than the other ones. Disney wanted everything to look computerish because it was meant to be within the computer. And when you design something, you always try to incorporate something of yourself. So it was the last shot we had in the movie. Went into the dailies the next day at Disney for everybody to see. Nobody saw it. So I pointed it out. Everybody thought it was great, keep it in. Because it was a minor tribute to where the movie was being made at. And we, 6 people, created ultimately at least 15 minutes of animation that went into a feature film. TRON came out in '82, and I think the group was terminated permanently in about mid-'83.
The issue that made me want to leave III when TRON was started was that it was kind of running out of technical challenges. It was really just an application of what we already had done and worked out.
We learned something, not to trust a gentleman's agreement on a handshake ever again, and we never did.
I was really looking for new frontiers, so I said, okay, well, I think my time here at III is done after 6 years, and we left and we hooked up and started a company, Digital Productions.